Hi there. This is Mr. Fernandez, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about how native born Americans responded to immigration in the Gilded Age, roughly between 1870 and 1900. Your learning target for this hopefully brief video lecture is that you'll be able to describe responses to immigration by native born Americans during the Gilded Age. Um, Not just the sort of cultural and social responses, but also political responses, the extent to which native born Americans were able to, or anti immigrant um, uh, activists were able to get government to address their concerns. A quick review of immigration patterns during the Gilded Age reveals, right, that one of the big trends during this time between roughly 1860 and 1900, this Gilded Age, is that immigration was skyrocketing. The number of immigrants that were arriving to the United States was greater than ever before, and really after for a long time. This was an era of peak immigration, in other words, just in general. Number two, there were important changes taking place in the area from which immigrants were arriving. Whereas before 1850, the vast majority of immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, that is, Britain, the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, even, um, uh, as well as France and places like that, uh, Germany. After the Civil War, beginning and really ramping up in the late 1800s, what you start getting is immigration, more and more immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, Greeks, Russians, etc., who were very different from the Northern and Western Europeans. Linguistically, they had a lot of different languages, very foreign languages, compared to Northern and Western Europeans, many of whom spoke English. And religiously, they were also very diverse, from the many Eastern European Jews who arrived during this time period to the Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics, etc. This was the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox. This was a very diverse religious immigration as well. So part of the activity you would have done if you were here, if we had block day, would have been to look at a large number of political cartoons and other images from the late 19th century about immigration. And what you would have seen is that there are two great trends during this time period. This is something I alluded to on Tuesday during class time. Many Americans embraced immigration during this time period. You can see in this cartoon, for example, it's called Uncle Sam is a Man of Strong Features. Strong features, meaning, and you notice that the Uncle Sam's face is made up of caricatures of immigration from people from various countries, including Chinese people in there. And according to this cartoonist, the suggestion is that immigration makes not just immigration. Here's a Native American, right, as the nose of Uncle Sam. Diversity makes America strong. It's the strength of America is in its diversity. Immigration is part of that diversity. This cartoonist's point of view is from a pro-immigration person. Um, the In 1908, at slightly after the Gilded Age, the famous phrase "the melting pot" came into the American lexicon. It was introduced by a playwright named Ira Zangwill, who wrote a play called The Melting Pot. And in that play, basically, the theme of it is that America is a great melting pot where people from all over the world come in and become Americans. You can see here in his quote there from the play, which is something that one of the characters says, that this artist suggests that immigration is a great thing. It's a good thing. It's what makes America. It is what makes America America. It is part of the American identity. In other words, immigration. Nothing says this more than the erection of the Statue of Liberty in 1886 in New York Harbor, um, uh, near the immigration station that will, eventually will soon be established there. The Statue of Liberty includes a poem by Emma Lazarus that is, quite famous. There it is. Again, the idea of America as a place of refuge for people from around the world was very much embraced by a lot of people during that time. So that's important to note. There was a very positive, on behalf of many, immigration was seen as a very positive force in American life. But some Americans were not so optimistic about immigration. And this cartoon suggests that Irish folks, this here is a caricature of an Irish person, are no, even though they're considered white, are no better than. Of course, this is a racist cartoon assuming that. Off you go, Penny. Don't get on the bed. Sorry, that was my cat. She's not allowed on the bed. That black folks are inferior. That's the assumption of this cartoonist, and that Irish people are no better than them. Right? This is a very common caricature of an Irish person at the time, kind of gorilla face, and non-white facial features, and for this cartoonist, the whites were kind of the African Americans of the North. Very racist, but certainly an emblematic of the kind of racist discourse of nativists during the time who questioned the very whiteness of European immigrants, especially European immigrants from undesirable places like Ireland or Italy or Russia, and question the very whiteness of those people. Here is a cartoon suggesting that these immigrants will never be fully American. They are hyphenated Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, Irish Americans. For this cartoonist, that they will never have their full allegiance, will never be with America. They will always be in part beholden to their so-called mother country, and therefore cannot really be fully American. This cartoonist suggests that Chinese people in specific can't be trusted, that they are gullible, that they are weak, that they are not fit for democracy. This was a very common complaint against, especially Asian immigrants, that if they were allowed to vote, they would be susceptible to white party bosses who would get them to do all kinds of fraudulent, corrupt things. As gullible as they are, this cartoonist also plays on the stereotype of Chinese people as laundry workers. Here they are, kind of laundering political ballots, engaging in fraud and corruption. And this is what would happen if Chinese people were allowed to vote, which of course they were not allowed to vote during this time, anywhere in the country. Of course, the Chinese are taking our jobs kind of discourse was very common, and it wasn't just for the Chinese. The immigrants are taking our jobs was one of the big ideas of the day for anti-immigrant activists. Here you have a Chinese worker doing all the jobs, probably for very cheap, and here you have white workers sitting around with nothing to do because they don't have jobs, thanks to the Chinese worker. So, to summarize, nativism was a very strong force in the late 19th century. Nativism means a rejection of immigration. And like I said, here are some of their fears. The immigrants will not assimilate, they will not become American, they will always be part something else, linguistically, culturally. As we've said before, their religion was a big concern for many nativists. Catholicism, especially, um, uh, was considered to be dangerous. Foreign radicalism, there was this concern that many of these immigrants were going to bring socialism and communism, which were new ideas at the time. They were going to bring those ideas with them to the United States. And many workers and labor unions feared that immigration was a way for business leaders to depress wages by bringing in lots and lots of workers and then creating a glut of workers, thus reducing wages for everybody. Also, labor union leaders were concerned that immigrants were often used as strike breakers. So when there was a strike, immigrants would be called in and they would take the place of the striking workers, thus dividing the working class. These were some of the fears of nativists at the time. And some policies were put in place to respond to these fears. European immigration was restricted during this time period. For the first time ever in American history, laws were passed restricting immigration from other countries. For example, in 1882, the federal government passed a law that made it illegal for idiots, lunatics, paupers, and convicts to arrive to emigrate to the United States. In 1892, Ellis Island in New York Harbor was made into an immigration station to establish immigrants. To inspect immigrants from Europe to determine whether or not they were acceptable and whether or not they passed the tests created by the 1882 law. So Ellis Island was a place developed specifically to restrict the undesirable kinds of immigrants. There was even a debate over literacy tests. There were some who said we shouldn't allow immigrants who can't read in their own language at home, meaning they would have too few skills. They would be illiteracy would suggest that they were uneducated and therefore wouldn't be able to contribute to the American economy as much as more educated immigrants were. And there was this debate about whether or not we should impose literacy tests. Now, here's the thing: many workers, working class people, were in favor of that kind of a test. Were in favor of immigration restrictions. They wanted to restrict immigration because they felt that, for all the reasons that we talked about here, business leaders, on the other hand, were opposed to immigration restriction. For them, immigration was important. It was a way of securing cheap labor. And you already know from before that business leaders had a very strong influence on government. And for that reason, during the Gilded Age, very few other laws were passed that effectively restricted immigration from Europe in particular. In fact, at the end of the day, only 2% of European immigrants who came through Ellis Island Immigration Station were ultimately turned back. 98% of immigrants from Europe were allowed into the country despite these laws, despite nativism. Business leaders in particular were insistent on keeping that spigot opened, keeping that gate opened to allow for a flood of immigrants to arrive into the U.S. and supply industry with cheap labor. But things were a little bit different on the other side of the country, in the West, where Chinese immigrants were the predominant immigrant group, or the biggest single immigrant group there. And let's have a few minutes to have a look at efforts in the West to restrict immigration. The learning target for this particular little subsection of the lecture is that you'll be able to evaluate the arguments on both sides of the debate around the U.S. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a bill proposed in Congress in 1882 that targeted Chinese people in specific, Chinese immigrants in specific. The big question is, should the United States restrict all immigration from China? That's what was debated in Congress in 1882. In order to understand the Chinese Exclusion Act, you have to look at the anti-Chinese movement in the West. From the very beginning, from the first time that miners struck gold in 1849 in California, and many, many thousands of people began to arrive in California. Chinese people were arriving too. And anti-Chinese sentiment was especially strong among workers in California, and this included people from Europe, so Irish, first-generation Irish immigrants, for example, were very, very prominent in the anti-Chinese movement. They considered themselves white. Chinese people were considered non-white, and other immigrants as well, workers, the working class. Their main concerns was that Chinese people would take white quote so-called white men's jobs. So this is a cartoon that kind of plays on the irony, right, of immigrants, immigrant groups being part of the anti-Chinese movement. Here you have Chinese people coming to America. Here you have a caricature of an Irish person, a black person, and then other kind of like European-y looking, immigrant-y looking people building a wall with the help of Uncle Sam to keep out the Chinese. Um, uh, the irony of immigrants fighting to restrict other immigrants was not lost on this cartoonist. And a number of laws were passed or policies were enacted as a result of this anti-Chinese movement. For example, the U.S. Page Act. The U.S. Congress passed a law called the Page Act that said that forced laborers and prostitutes would not be permitted to enter the U.S. Now, the idea was really pretty much to keep Chinese women from coming to the United States. Most Chinese women were suspected of being prostitutes because a lot were. A lot also came as kind of like second and third wives of Chinese men, and this was so foreign to Americans, to native-born white Americans, that they wanted it. They didn't want it. They didn't want it. Also, eradicating any opportunity for Chinese people to have families would make sure that the Chinese population would not proliferate in the West. So for all these reasons, the Page Act was passed, and pretty much most Chinese women were suspected of being prostitutes, so therefore the Page Act meant that very few Chinese women would be admitted after 1875. This decimated the Chinese family, making it impossible for Chinese people to have stable families here in the United States. And being one, and so this was one of the reasons why the Chinese population was almost 13 to 1 men to women. In 1879, California state constitution, a new constitution, restricted land ownership to persons of the white race or of African descent. The precise reason for that was to keep Chinese people from owning land, making it impossible for them to pass on wealth to the future generations that comes with land ownership, and making them relegating them, Chinese people, to the bottom of the economic ladder permanently. But perhaps the most egregious attempt to end Chinese immigration was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act proposed by Congress, the United States Congress, in response to the anti-Chinese movement in the West. And basically, the Chinese Exclusion Act said that any Chinese person who was a laborer, who came here to work, was denied entry into the U.S. If you came as a Chinese person to hang out, to be a tourist, the law didn't apply to you. If you came here as a Chinese person to work, the United States Chinese Exclusion Act would mean you were not allowed entry into the United States. That meant the vast majority of Chinese people would be restricted from coming to the U.S., since the vast majority of them came to work. So the law was proposed in 1882. You have a reading that goes into the arguments for and the arguments against Chinese immigration, or the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So take a few minutes, do the reading. There's some questions to answer on ManageBack. Answer those questions, and then come back to this lecture and finish up with the last remaining slides. Okay, welcome back. So you read about the Chinese Exclusion Act. You read the debates for, the arguments for and against. You answered some questions on ManageBack. Let me now tell you what happened. So the U.S. Congress does pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. President Chester Arthur does sign it into law, and the Chinese Exclusion Act becomes the law of the land, and some version of it will stay in place until for another at least 60 years. Chinese people are basically barred from coming to the U.S. for half a decade or more than half a century. In 1891, to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act, Angel Island Immigration Station was established in San Francisco Bay. Um, Still is there today if you want to go look at it. It is no longer in operation as far as I know, but it's still there. You can see, and it's kind of like the bizarro Ellis Island when you think about it. We go to Ellis Island and you see all kinds of really beautiful museum exhibits. Millions of people go to visit Ellis Island to kind of revisit, walk in the footsteps of their immigrant ancestors, and it's just kind of like celebration of immigration. Ellis Island is. You go to Angel Island Station, there's nothing like that there. Because whereas in Ellis Island, most people who came through Ellis Island were allowed to stay in the U.S. because they were coming from Europe. Angel Island Station was overwhelmingly a place of restriction. Most people who came through Angel Island Station were not allowed to stay in the U.S. because they were considered to be in violation of the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Page Act or some other law that restricted immigration from Asia. So, as this cartoonist suggests, Angel Island was kind of like a bizarro Ellis Island, um, established for the same reason, but with very, very, very different outcomes. And of course, that the debate around the fitness of immigrants to come to the United States still rages today. You know that President Trump is an outspoken opponent of immigration from certain parts of the world. Excuse me. And we've talked about that. And so there's still this idea that immigrants from some places are worse than immigrants from other places, or better. Sorry. This is a cartoon to enjoy. Anyway, oops. Anyway, here are the 2 learning targets. Review these. If you're good and you can answer these questions, or you can do these things, then great. You've met the learning targets. If you need to go back and revisit some part of the lecture, please do. You also should consider reading the Reading to Reinforce Learning assignment, because some of that will be covered. Some of this will be covered, or all of this will be covered in some of the reading that is due next week. Thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of your snow day.